Stop abusing target revisions in Argo CD. If you follow today's tip, your GitOps life will be a blissful nirvana. And to help you get there, I'll invite DevOps legend Viktor Farsic on to discuss building a culture of GitOps, all on today's episode of Argo Unpacked. I am your host, Dan Garfield, as always, and I'm going to be talking to you about some very fun, exciting GitOps things, like specifically not abusing target revisions and then building a culture of GitOps, which is something that's often overlooked when we talk about GitOps. We always talk about technical things. I'm going to give you a technical tip in a second. But when it comes to the biggest things that keep organizations from adopting GitOps, I find that it's actually the organizational things, the people problem, the meat space problem that prevents people from being successful a lot more often than it is the technical aspects of GitOps. Those things are often symptoms of people adopting anti-patterns driven by a culture that doesn't want to accept maybe the level of responsibility of GitOps or how it works with individuals, how that is maintained. So we're going to get into that with Viktor. But before we do, we're going to talk about a closely related feature, which is, of course, the target revision field in Argo CD. Inside of Argo CD, when you define your application, you can define a target revision as part of your source of truth. And that revision could be head, it could be a branch, it could be a revision. It could really be anything that you can point to in Git to get a specific commit or branch or whatever. And we've found that people really tend to abuse this field and it creates problems for them. So what am I talking about? A good example that most people are familiar with is the idea of using branches for environments. In this case, they'd create a branch for staging, a branch for production, a branch for US East, whatever. And then they have these long-running differences running in those branches. And this is actually an anti-pattern that has been pretty well disabused within the community, where people have been told over and over again, hey, don't use branches for environments. There's so many reasons not to do it. It makes diffing more difficult. It makes promoting changes more difficult. But people are still abusing revisions for other things. For example, maybe it's for promotions. Maybe they'll say, oh, I'm going to use this specific revision and then I'm going to update that revision in another application and then updating another application. And this is a way I could do promotions. I could promote a change by changing the revision field as I go along. Well, what's the problem with that? Why is that abuse? Why is that an issue? Well, for one thing, it means that by looking at your Git repository, you have no idea what is supposed to be deployed. Imagine Argo CD was erased tomorrow. How do you know how to get back to your infrastructure to the state that it was in? You actually have no idea what it was in, because that revision history of how you're updating those applications is happening separately from the manifests themselves. So those are now, you have to disentangle the relationship between Argo CD application updates and the manifest updates that you're trying to promote in the first place. So creating this division is confusing and unnecessary. It also means if you wanted to go into a disaster recovery scenario, you're going to have difficulty getting back to state by understanding which manifest should be deployed in which order, in which state, all those kinds of things. So that creates a problem. The other thing is, if you don't abuse this field, it means that your Git history of your manifest will always match the deployment history. That makes your life so much easier. If you're trying to figure out, oh, when was this deployed? When was that changed? You can just look at the manifest history and get all the information you need, rather than going and trying to figure out the Argo CD history. And a lot of people will actually do this where their Argo CD applications, maybe they're not even defined in Git and they're updating Argo itself. And so when you say, hey, what was deployed yesterday? You really have no idea, and there's no way to get that information. So that creates a lot of problems as well. So we see people using it for promotions, for kind of a poor man's promotions. We also see people using it for environment management, which is a problem. And we see people misunderstanding the basically using floating versions. So maybe they'll do something like, oh, I'm going to pin it to a version 2.4, and then if there are changes, they'll automatically be deployed. Well, that of course gets rid of your ability to do a revert or a restore back to a previous point, because you actually don't have that history in Git also. So for example, if I'm pinning to version 2.4, and 2.43, 2.44, 2.45 all come out, it'll automatically get deployed as those things are made available. But if you want to go and revert what's deployed, you then have to understand which version you're pinned to. You have to go and revert those tags. It creates this confusion about what's supposed to be deployed and when. So that creates an issue. There's also the issue of sorry, let me gather my thoughts for a second. I was on a train there and I was doing great, but I just lost it. We do really encourage people not to use Git hashes in target revision. That again goes back to often being used for promotions, and that creates issues. We really say, hey, use folders for this stuff. That's what they're designed for. They work really, really well. It makes it a lot easier to figure out what's going on. You can rebootstrap all of your infrastructure in one go. We do make a small carve out potentially for maybe an infrastructure app that doesn't change very often, where you just want to keep it set on a version specifically for a very, very long period of time. That might be okay. If you can avoid it, please avoid it. I'll throw in a chat. We have a whole blog post about this that goes in depth, and I'll throw this into the chat, and feel free to go and read the blog post in depth for why you should stop abusing target revisions in Argo CD. And with that, I think we're getting ready to get into the conversation now. If you haven't done it already, be sure to like the video, make a comment, subscribe. We appreciate it. It helps us get the message out there and helps us be more successful in encouraging us to do more of these. If you like us doing it, then please share it. If you don't like it, then don't share it, and maybe eventually it'll go away. In the meantime, let me bring in a GitOps and DevOps legend, Viktor Farsic, who is going to be joining us to talk about building a culture of GitOps. Welcome, Viktor.
Hey, nice to be here.
Yeah, so Viktor and I go way back. He's a friend of the show, and we've had the joy of presenting together at ArgoCon before, which was awesome. And I'm sure we'll have that chance again at some point in the future. So today we're going to talk about building a culture of GitOps. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but I found that a lot of organizations struggle to adopt GitOps not for technical reasons. They may look like technical reasons, but they're technical reasons dressed up in a trench coat that and label, and they're actually it's actually cultural reasons that are inside the trench coat. I munched the analogy, but you get the idea. So this is where people will say things like, "Oh, we have to do it this way." That's not very well supported because that's the way our organization works. And so they end up adopting some anti-patterns like the one that we just talked about of abusing the revisions field because their culture demands it. And so we'd like to figure out, what are some ways that you've seen culture abused? How do we get people to adopt a better culture? And what are some of those things we should look for? So that was the plan for what we talk about today. How's that sound, Victor?
Sounds great. Small correction. Oh no, actually two things.
Yeah, let's do it.
First, I still hear echo. I don't know whether it's me or it's you. I'm sure it's you. Anyways, it is very often technical. Not as often as cultural. Cultural problems, let's say, are the most common, without a doubt. But it's also often technical in terms that people are trying to put things in Kubernetes that shouldn't be in Kubernetes in the first place. Right? Typical distributed monolith. And then you say, hey, yeah, for me to deploy this thing, I need to do this, and then this, and then this, and then that, and then this, and then that, and so on and so forth, 57 different steps. Everything needs to go in specific order and what's not, and then it becomes complicated. But that's, besides cultural reason, that's more that people very often move to a different platform without wanting to make any change. Hey, how can we improve our WebSphere? Well, let's put it in Kubernetes. It will be so much better, right? Or WebLogic.
Yeah.
But let's focus on cultural now.
Well, so is my echo fixed, by the way? Is that better?
Yeah. Perfect.
I just put on my headphones, so maybe I was just getting some crosstalk. So sorry about that. Sorry for everybody. The whole intro I did, I felt like I was doing really great. And if you guys were all just hearing echo the whole time.
Intro was great because when I start speaking, then I hear myself coming from you.
Oh, okay. So it's when you're talking. So Got it. Okay, cool. So yeah, I mean, that's like one of the things that I see is people aren't used to using Git as a source of truth, right? Like they will update their application, it'll go through a build, but that doesn't actually affect operations in any way. And so they can just feel free to just continually push commits, push builds, push changes. And then later at some point, they'll decide, okay, I'm ready to consume that change. And so that's what we still see when people are using application repositories. But once they start using a DevOps repository, what's in Git is literally deployed. And I've seen people who have been like, okay, no, it's cool. I just pushed the commit. So when do we deploy it? And you're like, no, you just deployed it. And they're like, wait, what? Why? Like, who did that? Who pushed the button? It's like, yeah, there was no button. We don't have manual sync enabled. We have auto sync enabled, and people aren't used to working that way, and it makes them nervous.
I feel that this is not directly related to the subject, but somehow still is, that certain practices come with delay to certain groups, right? Like if you talk to an application developer, forget about GitOps, forget about Kubernetes, right? If you talk to application developer, that person will tell you that everything I do is always in Git. There is no discussion about that.
Yeah.
Right? If you're a application developer that just kind of keeps code on your laptop and never pushes it to Git, then there's something wrong with you, right? You're an exception. So it's very natural for application developers to put everything to Git. What is less natural is for other groups, depending on which point in time we're talking to, right? Testers, for a very, very long time, were not using it. I don't know whether they do it now. I hope they do, right? And similar thing is for operations. We are in the past, we were used to operate systems by going to a terminal, executing stuff, and then somehow stuff works, right? And now we are trying to explain to people that they should put stuff into Git. and it takes time until that settles in, right? Because
Yeah.
those are not always developers, right?
Well, another good example is that like most organizations don't use code owners files, right? Code owners let you define essentially permissions within a Git folder structure. So it's very common in the open source world for us to do this. We have like in Argo CD, we have different scoped roles for people to do approvals in specific directories, specifically part of the different of the project. But most organizations don't do that. They just say, hey, this is the repo. Everybody has access who's part of the team and nobody else has access. But when you move to GitOps, typically people start to have a repository where there are multiple teams working and they're like, oh, like somebody accidentally went and changed this thing over here and they weren't supposed to because they're not using code owners files because they've never had to use them before. But suddenly, because operations are happening in Git, it's actually really important to set your permissions properly with inside Git. And again, that's not, while that's a technical topic, what's really happening is that culturally people aren't thinking, oh, when I make a commit, I'm affecting other people's stuff, right? They're just thinking, oh, I'm just changing my thing. And they're not realizing that maybe they could affect other people's stuff within a repository.
Yeah. Kind of like it's, and that happens a lot in large organizations. It's simply different teams work in isolation, right? Kind of this is my thing. And that's what very often clashes also with GitOps. Very often we would have a repository that defines whole production because that makes so much more sense than repository that defines things that matter to you personally on your team. And then you're not used to that type of collaboration, kind of, well, no, but it's me, it's my team, kind of like,
Yeah.
I don't care about other people. I mean, nobody says I don't care about other people, but effectively that's what's happening, right?
Yeah. Well, this kind of goes back to one of the complaints about DevOps has been that I think Kelsey Hightower said like it resulted in a lot of kumbaya conversations and then no real change, where people had a lot of conversations and then maybe they didn't even change their process. And so I think that when people adopt GitOps, that rubber kind of meets the road where it becomes very obvious very quickly, like, oh, these teams aren't talking to each other because the record is in Git. Whereas before, maybe it was in a ticket, maybe it was in a change request, maybe it was an email. The way that people were working, they're like, oh, I told them to do this. I'm like, oh, did I get an audit log on that? Maybe they're using it as part of a ticket request that there was a thing that was happening there. But so many of those operations ended up being kind of shadow ops where it wasn't clear what was happening. And once it's all in Git, suddenly it's really clear who's doing what and how exactly everything works.
And most of the time with GitOps, it's actually nobody as in person is doing anything. Because realistically, you don't deploy new applications as if version 1 very often, right?
Mm-hmm.
You do not change the structure of a database or application or what's not very often. 99% of changes to your system are changes to the versions, right?
Yeah.
For every 1,000 releases I make, I change maybe once the definition of that something outside of the tag or the version of whatever it is, right? So you don't even, and that's the beauty of it, right? Kind of, there is nothing for you to do unless you get that Slack message that says, hey, things are not working anymore, right? More often than not, you have a process, you have some pipeline, workflow, CI, whatever you want to call it, that does whatever it does. You make a review of those code changes and so on and so forth. And eventually that becomes a pipeline that releases it to staging, production, what's not. You're not involved in that.
Yeah. If you've matured enough where you have good automating systems to handle the promotion of a change, to handle the tests. If you need approvals, maybe there's somebody to come in and click approve or something like that. But those things should mostly be automated so that as a developer, I basically wrote my code. I got it into my binary, my build service. and then I tagged it as kind of ready to go or ready to release, or I tagged it with a new version that's automatically going to get picked up and put into the promotion flow. So ideally, as a developer, I kind of don't have to touch Kubernetes manifests. We estimate, I think our estimation is that about 80% of the time you can do stuff with just pushing the new binary. And then there's those other changes that require some additional configuration change for people to do. But ideally, most of that stuff is automated. And I've noticed that some organizations, I've actually had someone tell me one time that they had to pull back on GitOps because people were uncomfortable with how fast changes got to production. And they were like, oh, I didn't realize it was going to happen that quickly. I didn't realize that it was already out. And it caused concern because maybe they actually hadn't done enough testing, enough validation. But those are the kinds of things that get exposed when you adopt GitOps, because if you're not doing that kind of testing and validation that you should be doing, someone else is covering for it right now in a shadow process, right? It's a DevOps person is covering for it in manual operations that they're doing that they're not talking about. But once you kind of, you're basically taking people out of the loop to do more automation with GitOps. And so that stuff is suddenly deployed and you're like, oh, wait, did we actually test that enough? Do we have enough coverage? But that forces a conversation around like change management. And if you're actually doing the stuff that you said or committed to doing that maybe you're not doing, maybe you haven't built that stuff. And so I find that GitOps ends up being really effective at exposing shadow operations and inadequate planning because suddenly you're deploying too frequently. You have that issue.
Yeah, and Joe cannot anymore influence the production without committing something to Git, without others knowing what he did. That's so horrible.
Do you think we shouldn't have named it Git Blame? Should there have been a different name put on that? It was Git Responsibility or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's really about having shared common knowledge, right? That's what Git is all about, right? How do we have a place where we reliably keep things? I'm not talking about GitOps, but Git in general, right? How can we keep things in a way that everybody can see what's going on, right? With my code, with my build scripts, with this or that, whatever it is, right? As long as that something is not big, like image or video or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that goes to another thing, is that as you're adopting GitOps, you're really working on a process around automation, right? Because you have a source of truth in Git. You should have gating that happens before something is merged, right? So you should have like a pull request. I'm actually shocked by how many organizations aren't used to working by pull request, right? They're just like, oh yeah, I just commit directly to the repo, because they're expecting that later they're going to decide to deploy that thing. And of course, with GitOps, it doesn't work like that. Like once you've committed, it's committed in the full sense of the word. It's there's no half commit, right? So you're fully committed once you make that commit. And so a lot of organizations, maybe they're not used to working by pull request, where those things should be gated.
People are not used to think of the main branch as, not people, some people are not used to think of the main branch as being really the reflection of the intent, what should be in production. Not what should be before production.
That's like a workspace.
That's the desired state of the production, whether that's whatever that something is, right? Not only Kubernetes manifest. That's supposed to be the reflection of the intent of what I'm supposed to have in production. If this shouldn't be in production, it shouldn't be there, right? It's very easy. But then people go crazy with branches, right? I'm proponent of, the only thing that makes sense in my head is that you have a feature branch you work on, you create a pull request, you merge to main, right?
Yeah.
Anything more complex than that, then I freak out.
Yeah.
When I hear, oh, I have a staging branch, I have the development branch, I have Joe's branch, and I have Nina's branch. And It goes from Nina to Joe, and from Joe to development, and from development to staging, and from staging to main. I'm simply not intelligent enough to understand how all that works. The problem is really my capacity of understanding what the heck is going on there.
No, and actually, I would even go a step further and say, if you want something deployed from a separate branch, it really needs to be a pull request that's opened, and you should be using something like a pull request generator that's going to deploy that thing.
Yeah.
Because by its nature, it should be short-lived, and it should be attached to the change process of the pull request rather than sitting in a random branch. But because I've asked someone before that was using branches for environments, and I said, okay, let's look at your Git repo and let's look at all the existing branches. Tell me which ones have something deployed. And suddenly it was, I actually don't know. It's like, yeah, I don't know. Because you have 100 branches that are open, and there are 10 of them that are special. They actually reflect, they're actually, if you touch that branch, it updates something in an environment somewhere, but all the other ones are not special. But Git doesn't have, like, we don't really have special branches. We have where head lives, and then basically everything else. There's just no room for special branches in GitOps at all. And that's another thing that culturally, like, people are used to, like you're saying, like with trunk development, when I'm doing application development, I'm going to use Git in that way. I'm going to have maybe my branch or whatever, but eventually I'll probably merge it into main. But I'm not going to have this idea of these long running branches.
Trunk-based development is awesome, just to be clear. It's just that very, very small percentage of people can really do it, right? If you're really advanced and you really can rely on your automated tests, on your processes and everything, right? If you figured out everything that comes after you pushing a change, trunk-based development is cool, kind of like, so I don't need to review. I can always assume that if tests pass, that's production ready, and so on and so forth. Kind of, that's awesome. It's just that there is very small percentage of teams that can actually really do it, right?
Yeah.
But if you're that advanced that you completely trust your system 100%, and there are no humans involved after you execute git push, go for trunk. Right? But there is such a small percentage of teams that can do it that
they can
it
actually
almost doesn't
get there.
exist.
Yeah, there's a lot of handoffs, right? It's like this team does this, then this team does that, then this team does that. So that is another artifact that we sometimes see pop into GitOps, where people want to have prescribed release steps where it goes from resource A to resource B to resource C, because they're managed by different teams. And the way that they used to work is some team would do each of those steps. And so when they say, okay, now that needs to be reflected in Git, you've actually not only not adopted GitOps all the way, you haven't really adopted Kubernetes all the way, because Kubernetes is all about the eventual consistency model. And so if your organization is designed around these procedural steps rather than like an eventual consistency model, then that's going to be reflected all of a sudden on the technical side, and it's going to look like a technical problem that you can't deploy service A before service B. But really it even goes back to just being an organizational problem because of the way you've organized, where you expect to be able to do that.
To be fair, it is often technical problem as well, because what often happens is that, okay, so let's say we have two applications in a database, right? And we work on this front end, and front end needs this specific backend, because I'm not coding front end against what is in production right now. I'm coding front end against future backend.
Yeah.
And that future backend will have an API that is not backwards compatible. And there will be a database that in which the way we manage schema in that database is not backwards compatible either. So the only way for us to release it to production is to have tightly coordinated steps until all the stars and constellations are in place. We can do it, and we can do it only in certain order, right? We need to change the database, but then we need to shut down the backend first because it will not work with the new schema. And then we're going to change the schema, and then we're going to put back the backend up, and then the front end will be failing because there were changes in backend API, and then we're going to put the front end up. And if we are very, very fast, then the downtime will be only half an hour, right? And we are so lucky. Yay for us, right?
But I could actually solve all those things with a sync hook or an init container or even a health check that says, hey, this is trying to start up, but the service version it's looking for isn't available yet. So it's just going to be sitting here in limbo until that does become available, right? And then I'm not having to do a procedure of git commit, make a sync, wait, then make a new git commit, because I can actually support kind of this eventual consistency model. There are resources though that don't work well for that. What I would say are like fragile resources, resources that once they're created wrong, stay wrong. And that would be things like having the proper load balancer set up. If you try to change it later, the other resources don't get updated, it becomes a problem. Or things like having the workload identity set beforehand. You kind of need some of those things. So there are things like that for a technical reason, but from a cultural standpoint, it is oftentimes that it is like one team manages this and another team manages that, and then they're trying to orchestrate and manage between themselves.
Exactly. And once you organize it in a way that this team manages this, that team manages that, right? None of those teams have incentive to be less efficient, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because doing things in a way that the rest of your system does not break, that's less efficient from the perspective of that team. Like every time I change API, if I have to make it backwards compatible so that clients using it can work with the old version as well as the new version and so on and so forth, that's less efficient for me. I have more work to put to make it happen.
Because I have to support your thing, not just my thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what we imagine.
Example.
I don't know, if
That's
you're using LinkedIn or X or Blue Sky or whatever API, imagine if everything would break the moment they release a new version of that API until everybody catches up. That would be disaster, right?
Yeah.
But for you as a team in charge of that and living in some kind of isolation, that's the most effective way to do it.
Yeah.
Why would
if you
waste
could just
time?
operate independently, and if you're running like 12-factor app style where each service can target the specific versions that it wants to work with, then you start to get that independence. And that's
but then you need to maintain those versions somewhere, right? So if I target version 7 of a backend API and you release version 8, you cannot just say from now on it's only version 8.
Yeah.
Either that version 8 needs to be backwards compatible, or there must be both version 8 and 7, right? In my code base. And that's going back to that less efficient. Because people choose, and this is the tragedy in companies, people choose efficiency of their teams over efficiency of the company.
Yeah, that's one of those rare cases where if the team is only working for itself, the entire organization actually becomes less efficient. They have to be thinking, they have to maintain a minimum SLA essentially for their the consumers of their services. Yeah.
If I can save a full day, a month of work, that will allow me to be more efficient and accomplish higher metrics or objectives that are given to my team. Now, if that day of saving results in a full week of loss of a company, my objectives are still okay. I'm good.
Well, it's like mutually assured destruction, right? Like if I don't enable that team to be successful, they stop enabling me to be successful, and then we both have to waste more time. So there is a natural incentive, right, to where you want to like, look, I know I have to spend a little more time to make these guys happy, but they're gonna do the same thing for me, so we're gonna be working together. But if they become disconnected, and disjointed in their process. And that's a good example too of like a cultural thing where it's like, no, like as a team, like we should have the sense of responsibility to each other for how we're working. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to meet the service level objectives for any of this stuff.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's why there should be always, I feel that whichever objectives you get, that should be company-wide objectives, never objectives of your team. That's the point, right? I remember a long time ago, we had that, okay, let's give every team objectives and what's not. And then testers got their objective, right? You need to increase the number of issues you detect by, I don't know what percentage, right? What did they do? They open, if the page does not load, there would be 50 different issues. The button is not there, and the field is not there, and the logo is not there, right? Page does not open, right? That's obviously one issue. But if you open 50, you accomplished your objective. Now, the fact that you are making all the developers miserable by having to close 50 different issues and go through them, even though they're all the same, not my problem, right?
Yeah, that's like the old what's the old story where in Soviet Russia they were required to produce a certain amount of chandeliers, but they were measured by weight. And so they were like, okay, we're just going to make lead chandeliers that can't be hung because that accomplishes the objective of making enough weight of chandeliers. So yeah, like getting the right measurements is pretty important here. You want to have teams operating with the sense of that they can be individually agile, right? They can get their changes into production, they can do it reliably, but that they can also maintain a certain SLO for their services so that other teams can continue to operate off of their services. And that kind of like multi-service architecture is definitely very common, though the number of nodes that need to be supported by each service are usually relatively small. It's usually not like there are hundreds of services that rely on this specific service, these specific versions. So usually it's a little bit manageable. But yeah, if teams don't take responsibility to say, oh, we might need to maintain multiple versions for compatibility so that other services can go through and be updated as they go on. Well, if you can manage that, there's a little bit of pain to it, but it enables in many organizations a faster pace of change over time. So I think there's a bunch of things like this that teams, when they're just saying, oh, I'm going to have Git be the source of truth, they may not be realizing that these other things probably need to change too.
Oh, you just said the word. I need to correct you, man.
Yes.
Git is not the source of truth.
No?
Absolutely freaking no. No,
What's
no,
the source of truth?
Source of truth are actual stuff. My pods, my EC2 instances, my databases, that's the source of truth. Git is the source of what I wanted.
Yeah, it's my desired state.
Desired state, yeah. That I give you, but source of truth is not, because that would assume that Git is always exactly the same as the actual resource is running somewhere, which is not true on many different levels. First of all, sometimes it doesn't work, right?
Mm-hmm.
But moreover, Git says deployment, but realistically, the source of truth at deployment, there is a replica set, there are pods spin up persistent volumes. All that is the source of truth. But
yeah, Git well, that's actual state.
Yeah, that's actual state. I mean, if anything,
when I say source of truth, what I'm saying is, if a controller, I've got a controller running, it needs to know what should be deployed. What's the source? If I have an actual state and I have a desired state, what's the state supposed to be? Is it in somebody's head? Is it written down in Jira ticket? It needs to be in Git. That's the source of truth for what should be the state.
Correct.
So I think you and I agree. It's just a question of how we define the term. But when it comes to the actual state, I mean, that's the whole point of GitOps and Argo CD, is that I have something looking at the actual state, comparing it to the desired state in my source of truth, and then making reconciliation. Now, reconciliation might even be, it's the word that we use. It might sometimes be too strong of a word, because reconciliation sort of implies that you have some from party A and some from party B. But typically with GitOps, we only take party A. We only take Git and we reapply it to the actual state. If there's something that's wrong in the actual state that's not accounted for in Git or set by some kind of policy in Git, then I need to change what's in Git to reflect that. So I don't have a controller that's like, oh, I noticed that, I mean, some people will say something like, oh, I've noticed that I need more pods, so I'm going to have a controller go and update Git to change the number of replicas. I think that's kind of, that's to me, that's meta state, right? Meta state saying like, I have an ignore differences on something like the replicas, and I've delegated control of that to a controller, and I have some sort of policy of like, I can go up to a certain number of pods or whatever. But that policy should be in Git as well.
Yeah, so it's actually, now when you talk about it, it's more like maybe not even the desired state, but more like intent, right? So
Yeah.
I want to have anything between 3 and 50 replicas of my application depending on X, Y, Z. Kind of like that's
Yeah.
what I'm expressing as intent that I want. And realistically, that deployment will have replicas set to 7, and then 15 minutes later, it will have it set to 8, and that will be set by horizontal pod autoscaler or whatever you're doing, and so on and so forth, right? So it's basically it's not actually that different from code itself, right? When you don't really run code as is, you put code in Git. That's the source of whatever.
Yeah.
But then it gets compiled, and then it gets
The actual
packaged,
thing is
and
the
then,
binary. Yeah.
yeah, the actual thing is eventually a binary, right? And that binary lives in a whole world of other dependencies and so on and so forth. It's a mess.
Yeah, and I sign it with a commit, right? Like I sign it with like, this is the commit that made that thing, so that I can
Correct.
say these are related. But there are things as part of that build process. You can rebuild the same Docker image multiple times, get different outcomes without changing anything under the surface.
That's why you don't. That's why you sign the built image. Kind of. You don't sign Docker file. Kind of. Oh, it's
yeah. Yeah, you don't sign the Docker file. Yeah, exactly. So to up level it a little bit from an organizational standpoint, up at like the management level of GitOps, most GitOps, again, we tend to think of it as being a technical thing that we do as practitioners, as DevOps people. Maybe our engineers consume it. But when you go up to the executive level, they're familiar with GitOps usually from business objective standpoint, like, oh, I know that GitOps reduces the time to deploy, so we actually are going to be more productive as a team. So I wanted to adopt GitOps. So they're incentivized. They have these ideas in mind of like the things that they can accomplish, but then they may not realize that by adopting GitOps, they actually need to invest more in testing or to invest more in training individuals. And it's actually, okay, let me ask you this. We've pushed for a long time as an industry to make developers care less about infrastructure. Does GitOps make people have to care more about infrastructure? Does it push them more into that, the mythical full stack developer, because they need to be engaged a little bit with Kubernetes? And is that part of the point? Because some people say, hey, I want people to do that because now they can take more responsibility for what makes it to production. They can be more effective taking more responsibility rather than passing things over a wall, and we can shorten the time. What's your view on that?
It depends on scale, right? If you're talking about some startup, let's say we have 10 people, I spent most of my life in startups. We all know everything and we all do everything, and that's fine. And then you're looking for people who are very more T-shaped kind of people that, okay, so yeah, you're writing code, but are you familiar with Kubernetes so that you can actually deploy it yourself? There is no special team for that, and so on and so forth, right? But after you pass some threshold, you need specialization, right? You can spend your whole life on large scale, your whole life just being focused on databases and still be confused how to remediate some issues. And I'm talking about large scale, right?
Yeah.
So you need, at some point, you need to be specialized, and you cannot say, okay, I know everything about everything, because either you're very small scale or you're lying, right? So I don't believe in the concept of full stack developer. I don't believe even in the concept of, hey, you're an ops person and you can manage all operations, right?
Yeah.
Because it becomes too complex for any single person to do it. But that does not exclude you knowing a bit about everything, because
Yeah.
everything affects your work somehow. So let's say Kubernetes, right? And let's say that I'm an application developer. Now, to be really proficient in Kubernetes, it takes years. That's it. Kind of, there is no way to go around it. It takes years to be proficient in Kubernetes. I cannot spend those years if I'm, let's say, TypeScript developer that works on a front end. That being said, I cannot be completely ignorant of its existence because it affects my work. If I don't understand how horizontal scaling works, the design of my application will be done in such a way that horizontal scaling will not work.
Yeah.
Right? Because, okay, so I need to understand this and that so that the design of what I'm doing is actually correct. Right?
Yeah.
So some kind of high level understanding of the system is required, but you cannot
Yeah.
go in depth
Like I
on all
should
fronts.
know if a value that I need to pass to my binary, if that should be an environmental variable, if it should be a secret, if it should be a config map. There's some basic stuff that as a developer you should probably know, or at least have some idea of. But you don't necessarily need to know like how volume claims work. You could just say like, look, I don't know, like they told me to put this thing in and I get my volume and I don't worry about it after that. You could probably get away with that on a lot of things, but you do need to have some of those basics.
Let's say that your application needs to talk TLS, right?
Yeah.
Now, I don't have to learn ISTI or whatever we are using for that, or Cilium, to understand it. But I need to understand enough that I don't start implementing TLS in the code of my application.
Right.
Otherwise,
Right.
I'm really wasting my time, right?
Right. Yeah. So some of that comes down to like operators educating developers on the things that they need to know, documenting those things, so that they know, hey, we're
It's
implementing TLS. Here's my ask of you, or here's how our system works, so they don't go down some rabbit hole.
it's about, I would not say operators educating, it's about everybody educating everybody,
Mm,
because it's very dangerous to say, okay, so operators have to educate application developers, as if there is nothing that application developers should educate operators, or testers should
yeah, it's a good
educate,
point.
so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can turn it around and say, without you as an operator, and let's say that you're constructing how we're going to run our applications, what's not, you don't understanding some basic differences between Java and Go will also result in the same problem as I was saying before. You will not be able to actually set it up to run correctly.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that you should go to a boot camp for 2 years to learn Rust? No. But should you understand some basic differences? Of course you should.
You
So
could
it always
almost
goes both
say,
ways. We are very,
yeah.
all of us are in certain area, and all of us tend to complain about others, and very often miss that actually those same complaints apply to us.
Yeah, to the yeah, that's a great point. So that to the extent that DevOps as a practice is just getting people to talk to each other, you probably can't adopt GitOps without adopting DevOps. Because if you don't have that understanding of needs between between developers and operations, it's going to be pretty hard for you guys to like codify that and operate from Git.
And I feel that that's where really abstractions come in, right? So let's say that I have a couple of options. Let's say that I'm an application developer, right? And somebody gives me a Helm chart and just say, I don't know, change those two values, and you will never find out whether that is working or not, because what is happening in a cluster is completely disconnected from that Helm chart. It won't work, right?
No.
But if you build some abstractions and say, okay, so those are the things that matter to you, whatever, right? This is the knowledge that those are the things that matter to you, and those are the things that you should know. There is a whole range of other stuff, right, that is beyond you, and that's fine, right? That's what we manage beyond those abstractions. Let's say that you want a VM to have a VM, right? Now, a good example of that abstraction would be EC2 instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you need to learn and understand and figure out hyperscalers? No. You absolutely don't. Even if you want, you will never see hyperscaler in AWS because that's completely abstracted from you. But that abstraction that they created is at least the intention is, that would be a separate story, that's on a level of the things that you really care about. Okay, so I have abstraction that says I can specify the region and I can specify the operating system, right? That matters to me. AWS gives me abstraction. I actually use it. I can see logs related to that. I will still not see logs of the hyperscaler, right? Of the hypervisor. And if you create those abstractions, then people can go outside of their comfort zone and say, okay, I'm not only interested in TypeScript, I'm also interested in how my application runs, but I cannot go to the depth to know everything, right?
Yeah. Well, that's
exactly
the top. Well, sorry, finish your point. Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
That's exactly the point of this conversation, is that technical decisions are downstream of culture decisions. So when we're designing that system and we're saying, you're going to have an interface well, do I want you to self-serve or do I want you to go through operations team? Well, I'm going to build a totally different technical structure if I want you to self-serve versus if I want you to go through an operations team. Because if I want you to self-serve, maybe I build an application set and you just have a folder structure that you follow. And you're self-serving all that stuff by just following this folder structure. You may not even work or those things, so you can operate in the dark. But if I don't want you to self-serve, I want you to go through an operations team. Now suddenly, instead of telling you here's the folder structure to follow, I'm just saying go fill out a ticket. Well, because I told you to go fill out a ticket, you don't follow the folder structure, and now all of my repos actually look different. Everybody's actually doing a distinctly different process because I didn't have that decision from a cultural standpoint about who was going to own which part of the process.
When I actually strongly disagree with the ticket part. So
you disagree with the ticket part.
Let me explain.
Yeah, sure.
I think that going to a different person instead of self-serving is fine when the team is small, right? And okay, it's 10 of us, it's 15 of us in total, right? And Joe will do that for me. And I'm never going to open a ticket for Joe, because what's the point of having Jira tickets if it's 15 of us? He's sitting right next to me.
Sure.
That's a very agile way. Once you established, all the shenanigans, Jira tickets, we're a big team and so on and so forth, that's already when self-serve is a must. I'm not saying that it is used in practice, but it's a must, because simply you cannot, it's close to impossible to scale people to infinity, right? Because, okay, so I have 5 developers and 1 operation people serving 5 developers. I have 10 developers, 2 operation people. I have 1,000 developers, other people in operations, right? That does not work.
No.
And that's a waste of time, because you just create something as a service. So I'm very good at this, whatever that is. I'm very good at defining applications in Kubernetes. Cool. We agree on abstraction, whether that's application set, whether that's a Helm chart, whether that's a CRD, doesn't matter, right? And you do this, and you should never. I don't want to speak with you ever.
Right.
Everybody's focused on more communication. No, I want less communication. I don't need communication between people when services work.
No, you need a lot of communication to get to the point where you don't need any communication.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I need a lot of communication to figure out what is really the right level of service that I should provide to people.
Yeah.
If I go back to Amazon, right? Amazon had to do a lot of communication until they figured out, I don't know, RDS, right? They talked with many companies, they talked with many teams, they did the infinite number of iterations. But now that it's running and it's working, how often do you... Okay, so here's the equivalent of the previous example. I take up my phone and call AWS. I need an RDS.
Yeah.
And they create.
They're like, oh, we'll get the team together. We're gonna scope it with you. We're gonna do a design meeting.
Exactly.
We're gonna
open a Jira issue. Open a Jira issue, and you will get RDS. Or I need to upgrade my RDS. No, you don't talk with them. So if you think of AWS as being extension of your team, you talk with them when it doesn't work.
Imagine if every button in AWS said contact sales. That's essentially what a lot of organizations do internally with Kubernetes, where instead of having that self-service kind of mindset, they're like, oh yeah, talk to operations and they're going to do it for you, or they're going to design it for you. You're going to blah, 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 blah. But to get to the level where you can say, oh, I'm just going to make this commit and that's going to deploy this infrastructure, you have to have all of these policies, procedures in place in a very predictable, turnkey, standardized way. You can't be as bespoke as you might like to be with that. My buddy used to call it gold plating. When you ask somebody like, hey, I need a doorknob installed. And they're like, oh, great, no problem, I got it. And you come back and you're like, is that installed? They're like, no, I'm working on it. It's gonna be amazing, don't worry. And you're like, oh, okay. And you come back like a week later and they're like, okay, I got it installed. It costs $6,000. It's gold plated. It's gorgeous. And you're like, I just needed a doorknob. Like, I didn't need this whole
It's your verse. Imagine if you had to call the guy whenever you wanted to actually to use the doorknob.
yeah.
I'm in front of the door. I want to enter my house. Can you please come?
No, you get it. You get it. And there's a doorknob, but it doesn't even turn.
No.
They're like, oh, you wanted a latch too? Oh, that's extra.
I actually had that conversation a few months ago. I'm not going to name the company, but the conversation went into the direction of, no, because of this and that, whatever the reasons are, we cannot allow people to self-serve. They need to go through us whenever they need this and that. And I was like, okay, cool, fair enough. Where is that running? In AWS. Cool. So are you calling AWS every time you need something? No, that would be ridiculous. My answer was, that's the point.
But you're saying it's okay if you make your teams call you every time they want to run something.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
But when you're on the other side of that chain, then that's unacceptable.
Oh, no. Yeah, it's totally ridiculous.
Ridiculous.
I think my wife always says like she's like, oh, I have to call somebody. And she's like, I give up. She's like, if I have to call somebody, it's like, I don't want to do that. Like, like if we had to call somebody to buy the tickets to go to the concert, it's like, nah, I'm done. I'm out. She's like, I don't want to talk to anybody to do it. If we ever want to order food or something, we used to call and order food, but now you're just like, you use an app to do it. And it's the same thing with organizations. Like, you want to enable teams to be individually responsible, to be able to self-serve, to be able to operate independently because they can move quicker. But all those cultural values that you might have, those are gonna really inform the technical decisions that you make, and the technical dysfunction that you experience may actually be the result of an organizational cultural decision that was made 5 years ago that nobody has challenged. And so you end up having to accept these difficult technical constraints that are not, that they're not inevitable. They're just things that are happening because we made a decision earlier about how these teams were going to work and the expectation they were going to have together. And that is the essence of what we wanted to get through today, is this discussion about like enabling a culture of GitOps, and that's downstream. So hopefully that's clear for our viewers who listen to that, and makes more sense now that we've talked about it. Viktor, we're in the last few minutes. Anything you want to add or promote at the end?
Let me think. Okay, so here's a note.
Yeah.
If you're in that situation, kind of like what we were talking about, kind of self-serve and stuff, that's such a good place, because you're not at the front, meaning that all you have to do, apart from making decisions, is to actually do what others did before you. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? The first, like Googles of the world, they're in a much more complicated situation because they need to figure out how to do something that has never been done before.
Yeah.
But if you're somehow behind, then all you have to do is just to see what others are doing, pick up the solutions that already exist. You don't have to develop you don't have to write your own solutions even. You don't have to write Borg. You can use
Right.
Kubernetes, right?
Right.
You don't have to come up with best practices. You can just Google them.
There
right?
are best practices.
Yeah.
You can just follow the best practices. And that's, if you see a best practice and you're like, oh, that wouldn't work in my organization, that's a big clue that you should maybe re-examine something that your organization is doing. Oh, geez, why wouldn't that work for us? Why is it that the thing that works so well for so many other people wouldn't work for us? What makes us so special? What choices have we made, maybe unknowingly, that make it so that we can't adopt the thing that works for 95% of the rest of the world? There are situations that come up where, you know, it really does. You're innovating in a way that makes sense, where you're doing something special that should be done special, and you can continue to innovate on it. But it's probably 1 in 100.
Yeah.
That you actually should be doing something special.
Even when you, I mean, every company has something special, whatever that is. But no matter where you are, kind of how far up front you are or far behind, that something special is always a fraction of what you have, right? Because, okay, so this algorithm is special. This is something very unique to us. But everything else, kind of how we run databases, how do we do networking, how do we do this, that's not special. Kind of special is always a small part because the systems are big, right? You might be working on, you might be Anthropic, right? And how they create models is special. Now, how they run their website is not special. Not special at all, right? They're doing it in the same way as everybody else did it before them.
Yeah. Great point. Okay. Thank you, Viktor. That was a fun discussion. I hope that was fun for you and for our listeners. You can catch Viktor on X. He is V Farsic. He just posted on YouTube a great video, a deep dive on Kubernetes controllers. Follow his content at DevOps Toolkit on YouTube, as well as DevOps Paradox. And always great to have you on, Viktor. And a good call out, since you brought up, hey, if I think I'm a special snowflake, or maybe I'm trying to figure out how to follow this well-worn paths, or I'm trying to figure out what those best practices are, registration is open still for ArgoCon, KubeCon. We've got one coming up in Atlanta in November. We've got the KubeCon EU happening in Amsterdam next March. And those CFPs for KubeCon Europe are open right now, but only for another week. So if you want to get a talk in, now is the time. And I'll just put this out there for anybody. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter or on X at Today Was Awesome. If you want help looking at your CFP, I help review those talks and build those schedules and run those conferences. So happy to give an eye to it before you submit it, if I can be of any help at all. And Viktor's another one who's great to bounce off of if he has time for it. So thanks again for joining us on this episode of Argo Unpacked. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about something. I don't remember what it was now, but you can
I'm
follow us
sure
on
it's gonna
Argo
be something.
Unpacked. Yeah, it'll be something. It'll be on argounpacked.com. You can follow everything that's happening there, and we're gonna have a good discussion. And looking forward to talking. We've got one coming up with Adobe. They're gonna come on, and we've got some other ones coming up. So anyway, that'll be great. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.